I still remember the exact moment my daughter-in-law stood in the middle of my living room, arms crossed, chin lifted, and told me that this was no longer my house. That, from now on, things would be done her way if I wanted to stay in my son's life. That was the moment my heart dropped into my stomach, and something inside me quietly broke, because this was the boy I raised alone, the child I protected with everything I had, and now a woman who had known him for barely 2 years was trying to erase me from my own home. I'm telling you this because I honestly need to know, was I wrong for what I eventually did? Or would you have reacted the same way if someone walked into your life and tried to take control of your child and your dignity all at once? Before I get into how things exploded so badly, you need to understand who I am and how I got here. I'm a woman in my late 50s, a single mother for most of my adult life, and my son has always been the center of my world. His father passed away when he was just 6 years old, and overnight I went from being a wife with a partner to a woman carrying the weight of 2 roles on her shoulders. I worked long hours, skipped meals, turned down relationships, and pushed my own dreams aside so my son would never feel like he was missing something. Our home was small, but full of warmth, laughter, and routines that were ours. Sunday breakfasts late, night talks at the kitchen table, me sitting on the edge of his bed when he had nightmares even as a teenager. We grew up together in many ways, and that bond was deep, emotional, and unbreakable. Or at least I believed it was. When my son told me he was getting married, I won't lie, I felt a mix of emotions. I was happy for him, of course, but there was also fear. Fear of being replaced. Fear of becoming invisible. Fear that the life I built around him would suddenly have no place for me. Still, I welcomed his fiancée with open arms. I smiled, cooked her favorite dishes when she visited, complimented her, asked about her family, and genuinely tried to build a connection. I wanted to be the kind of mother-in-law people talk about positively, the one who supports without interfering, who loves without smothering. Her name was Sarah, and at first she seemed polite, quiet, even a little shy. She would thank me for meals, laugh at my stories, and hold my son's hand tightly as if she adored him. I told myself my fears were silly. The first crack appeared shortly after the wedding. My son and Sarah decided to move in with me, temporarily, to save money for their own place. It was supposed to be a short-term arrangement, something practical and sensible. I agreed without hesitation. This was my home, yes, but it was also my son's home, and I wanted to help them start their life together. At first, everything seemed fine. I adjusted my routines, gave them privacy, and made sure they felt comfortable. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Sarah started making comments about how I ran the house. Little things at first. She would say things like, "In my family, we don't eat so late." Or, "I think it's healthier if we rearrange the kitchen this way." I brushed it off, telling myself she was just trying to settle in. Then the comments became instructions. She moved my dishes without asking. She threw out food she claimed was too unhealthy, even though I had bought it with my own money. She criticized the way I cleaned, the way I spoke, even the way I dressed around the house. Each time, my son would stay quiet, eyes down, as if hoping the tension would dissolve on its own. I tried talking to him privately, gently at first. I told him I felt uncomfortable, that I felt disrespected. He would sigh, rub his face, and say things like, "Mom, she's just stressed." Or, "Can you please be patient? I don't want problems." So I swallowed my feelings again and again, telling myself this was what mothers did. But inside, I felt myself shrinking. The house that once felt like a safe space began to feel foreign. I would wake up anxious, wondering what rule had changed overnight, what invisible line I might cross. Sarah started speaking to me like I was a child, correcting me in front of guests, rolling her eyes when I talked. The worst part wasn't even her behavior, it was my son's silence. Every time he didn't defend me, it felt like a small betrayal, a reminder that I was losing him inch by inch. The day everything truly spiraled out of control started like any other. I was in the kitchen early in the morning, making tea, when Sarah walked in and began complaining about the groceries I had bought. She said I was wasting money, that I didn't understand budgeting, and that from now on, she would handle all household decisions. I laughed nervously at first, thinking she was joking. Then she looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I'm serious. This is our family now, and things need to change." Something in her tone chilled me. I told her calmly that this was still my house, that I was happy to compromise, but I wouldn't be ordered around. That's when she raised her voice and said the words that still echo in my head, that my son had chosen her, that I needed to accept my place or I would push him away forever. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of her. I told her she had no right to speak to me like that, and she stormed off to our shared living room, where my son was sitting on the couch. She immediately began telling her version of the story, painting me as controlling, outdated, and toxic. I watched my son's face twist with confusion and exhaustion. When he finally spoke, he didn't look at me. He just said, "Mom, can you please try harder? I don't want to be stuck in the middle." That sentence hurt more than anything Sarah had ever said. In that moment, I realized how alone I truly was. I went back to my room and closed the door, hands shaking. I replayed every sacrifice I had made. Every night I stayed up worrying about him. Every time I chose his needs over mine. I wasn't asking to control his life. I wasn't asking to come first. I just wanted basic respect in my own home. Is that really too much to ask? I kept asking myself if I had failed somewhere, if I had raised him wrong, if loving him so deeply had somehow made me disposable. This was the emotional place I was in when the situation reached a point of no return, and this is where I want you to really think about what you would do. Imagine opening your heart and your home to your child and their partner, only to be treated like an obstacle, like an inconvenience that needs to be managed or removed. I was standing at the edge of a decision that would change my relationship with my son forever, and I didn't know if staying silent would save us or destroy me completely. This was only the beginning of a much bigger storm, and trust me, what happened next shocked everyone involved, including me. As I look back now, I realize that this story isn't just about a controlling daughter-in-law or a silent son. It's about a woman slowly being pushed out of her own life, piece by piece. If you've ever felt replaced, disrespected, or unheard, you'll understand the weight I was carrying at that moment. And before you judge what I eventually did, remember that this was just part one of a long, painful journey that forced me to choose between keeping the peace and reclaiming my self-respect. Like this video if you're already feeling my side of the story. Subscribe if you want to hear how this all unfolds, and stay with me, because the next part is where everything starts to burn. I'll see you in the next part of this story. After that day, after I locked myself in my room and cried into a pillow like I hadn't cried in years, something shifted inside me. I woke up the next morning with swollen eyes and a heavy chest, but also with a strange clarity. I realized that if I didn't start paying attention to what was happening around me, I would slowly disappear inside my own house. I decided I would observe everything quietly. I would stop reacting emotionally and start noticing patterns, because deep down I knew this wasn't just stress or adjustment issues. This was about control, and more importantly, about my son being slowly pulled away from me in ways he didn't even realize. Over the next few weeks, I watched how Sarah operated. She was clever, I'll give her that. In front of others, she was sweet, respectful. even caring toward me. If relatives visited, she would offer to help me in the kitchen, call me Mom loudly, and smile as if we were the perfect family. But behind closed doors, her tone changed completely. She would correct my son constantly, tell him how to speak, what to wear, how to spend his money. At first, it sounded like concern, but the more I listened, the more I noticed how she framed everything as his idea while subtly steering him where she wanted. If he disagreed, she would sigh dramatically or go quiet for hours, creating a thick tension that only lifted when he apologized. Watching this broke my heart, because I saw my confident, kind son becoming hesitant and anxious, always checking her face before speaking. One evening, I overheard them arguing in their room. I wasn't trying to listen, but voices carry in an old house. Sarah was crying loudly, saying she felt unsafe and unwelcome, that living with me was damaging her mental health. My son kept apologizing, saying he would fix it. When she said, "It's either me or her, I can't live like this," my knees actually went weak. I sat down on the edge of the stairs, my hands trembling. I never imagined my son would be put in that position, and I never imagined I would be framed as the villain simply for existing. The next day, my son approached me with a seriousness that made my stomach drop. He said Sarah was struggling, that she felt judged and uncomfortable, and that maybe it would be best if I gave them more space. I asked him calmly what that meant. He hesitated, then said maybe I could stop using the living room in the evenings, maybe eat dinner earlier, maybe keep to my room more so they could feel like a real couple. I stared at him, trying to process his words. He was asking me to shrink my life down to a bedroom in the house I paid for, the house I built after his father died. I asked him if he thought that was fair. He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. From that point on, the emotional distance between us grew rapidly. Sarah started making house rules and presenting them as mutual decisions. She told me when I could do laundry, complained about the noise of my TV, and once even asked me to ask permission before inviting my sister over. Each time I pushed back, she would twist the situation later, telling my son I was aggressive or dismissive. I started writing things down in a small notebook, dates, words, moments, not because I planned revenge, but because I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I needed proof that I wasn't imagining things. What hurt the most was watching my son change how he spoke to me. He used to call me every day, even when we lived together, just to check in. Now, even under the same roof, he barely spoke unless necessary. When he did, his tone was cautious, distant. He stopped sharing his thoughts, his worries. I felt like I was mourning someone who was still alive, and that grief was heavy and constant. At night, I would lie awake, replaying conversations from his childhood, wondering how we went from that closeness to this cold politeness. One afternoon, I finally tried to talk to Sarah directly, woman to woman. I invited her to sit with me at the kitchen table. I told her I wasn't her enemy, that I wanted peace, that I wanted my son to be happy. She listened quietly, then leaned back and said something that made my blood run cold. She said, "I understand you're used to being the most important woman in his life, but that's over now. You need to accept that." There was no anger in her voice, just certainty. That's when I realized she didn't see me as family. She saw me as competition. After that conversation, things escalated quickly. She began suggesting to my son that they move out immediately, even if it meant taking on debt. She complained constantly about my presence, about my habits, about my personality. My son started spending less time at home, working late, avoiding confrontation. And every time I tried to reach him emotionally, he pulled further away. I felt like I was standing outside a locked door, knocking softly, while someone on the other side whispered lies about me. The breaking point came on a rainy evening when I came home from work, exhausted to find my personal belongings boxed up in the hallway. My books, my photo frames, even some of my late husband's things. Sarah stood there and said she thought it would be healthier if I downsized my space since they needed more room. I asked her who gave her permission to touch my things. She shrugged and said my son agreed it was for the best. When I confronted him, he looked ashamed but didn't deny it. That was the moment something inside me hardened. I realized that staying silent was no longer protecting my son. It was enabling someone to erase me. So let me pause here for a moment, because this is where I really want to hear from you. Up until this point, I had tried patience, understanding, silence, and sacrifice. I had swallowed my pride, my anger, my heartbreak. If you were in my place, watching your own child slowly hand over control of his life and your home to someone who clearly wanted you gone, what would you do? Would you keep quiet to keep the peace? Or would you finally stand up, even if it meant risking everything? Before I tell you what I decided, take a second and really think about it, because the choice I made next changed all our lives forever. After that night, I stopped trying to please Sarah. I stopped apologizing for existing. I calmly told my son that this situation was no longer healthy for me and that something had to change. He looked relieved, as if he was glad someone else was finally taking responsibility. That realization hurt almost as much as everything else. I began preparing myself emotionally for the possibility that I might lose him, because I finally understood that loving someone doesn't mean allowing yourself to be destroyed. This part of my story ends here, at the edge of a decision that terrified me, but also gave me strength I didn't know I had. The confrontation, the truth, and the consequences are all still ahead. If you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't. Like this if you're still with me. Subscribe if you want the rest of this story, and share your thoughts below, because part 3 is where I finally stop being silent and start fighting back. I'll see you in the next part. By the time part 3 of this story began, I was emotionally exhausted but strangely calm, like someone who has cried so much that there are no tears left. The house felt tense all the time, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting for the next explosion. I moved through my days carefully, choosing my words, controlling my expressions, but inside I was preparing myself for something I had avoided my entire life. Standing my ground even if it meant losing my son. That thought alone used to terrify me, but now it sat quietly in my chest like a painful truth I could no longer ignore. After the night I found my belongings boxed up, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my late husband, about the promises we made to raise our child with love and strength, about how proud he would have been of the man our son had become. And then I wondered what he would say if he saw me now, being pushed aside in my own home. That thought gave me a strange sense of resolve. I decided that the next conversation I had with my son would be honest, calm, and final. No more hints, no more emotional pleading, no more hoping he would suddenly see what was happening. The next evening, I asked my son if we could talk privately. Sarah wasn't home, which already felt like a small mercy. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with homework, where we celebrated birthdays, where we mourned his father together. I told him I loved him more than anything in this world, and that nothing would ever change that. Then I told him I was deeply unhappy, that I felt disrespected and erased, and that the current situation was damaging my mental and emotional health. I spoke slowly, carefully, choosing honesty over accusation. I told him that I could no longer live like a guest in my own home. He listened quietly, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the table. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said something that shattered me in a way I wasn't prepared for. He said he understood how I felt, but he also said Sarah was his wife now, that his priority had to be his marriage, and that maybe it would be best if I considered finding my own place or spending more time elsewhere. I stared at him, trying to understand how my own son could suggest that I leave my home so his wife could feel more comfortable. I asked him if he realized what he was asking of me. He said he knew it was hard, but he didn't see another solution. That was the moment I truly understood that my son was no longer making decisions freely. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't heartless, he was trapped. And while part of me wanted to scream and beg him to wake up, another part of me realized that I couldn't save him by sacrificing myself. I told him calmly that I would not leave my home, but that things could not continue as they were. I said either we find a respectful way to live together, or they would need to make other arrangements. He looked shocked, as if the idea of his wife moving out instead of me had never even crossed his mind. When Sarah came home later that night, he told her about our conversation. I could hear raised voices from their room, sharp and angry. At one point, she stormed out and confronted me directly, accusing me of trying to manipulate my son and destroy their marriage. She said I was selfish, controlling, and emotionally abusive. Each word felt like a slap, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told her I was done being disrespected, that this was my home, and that I would no longer accept her making decisions for me or speaking to me the way she had been. That only made her angrier. She told me that if I didn't back off, she would make sure my son cut me out of his life completely. That threat haunted me more than I want to admit. After she slammed the door, I sat alone in my room, shaking, replaying her words over and over. Losing my son felt like losing my heart. But then I asked myself a question that changed everything. What kind of relationship would I really have if it only existed because I allowed myself to be mistreated? Was that love or was that fear? Over the next few days, Sarah escalated her behavior. She stopped speaking to me entirely, but made sure my son knew how miserable she was. She cried, complained of panic attacks, and accused me of creating a hostile environment. My son became increasingly anxious, snapping at me over small things, clearly overwhelmed. I watched him crumble under the pressure, and it hurt more than any insult Sarah could throw at me. I realized that as long as we were all under the same roof, this manipulation would continue, and my son would never be forced to truly see it. That's when I made a decision that even now feels heavy to say out loud. I decided to give them a deadline. Not out of anger, not as punishment, but as a boundary. One evening, I sat them both down and told them that they had 60 days to find their own place. I said it calmly, without shouting, without insults. I explained that this was my home, that I needed peace, and that continuing like this was destroying our relationship. Sarah laughed bitterly and said I was heartless. My son looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe I was capable of standing up for myself. After that conversation, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Sarah told anyone who would listen that I was throwing them out, that I was a cruel mother who couldn't let go. Some relatives stopped calling me. Others hinted that I should just apologize to keep the family together. I felt isolated and judged, but also strangely empowered. For the first time in a long time, I was choosing myself. Now this is the point in the story where I really need you to stop and think. Up until now, I had tried everything to keep my family together, and it only led to more pain. I had finally drawn a line, and I knew there was no turning back. If you were in my place, knowing that your decision might permanently damage your relationship with your child, but also knowing that continuing would destroy you, what would you do? Before I tell you what happened next, pause for a moment and ask yourself that honestly, because what came after this was the most intense, heartbreaking, an eye-opening experience of my life. The days leading up to the deadline were filled with tension, tears, and silent battles. Sarah packed dramatically, making sure I saw her crying, telling my son she felt unsafe and unloved. My son barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were cold. Every night, I questioned myself, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But every morning, I reminded myself why I had done this in the first place. I wasn't trying to control my son. I was trying to survive. This part of the story ends with them still in my house, the deadline looming, emotions running high, and a confrontation that neither of us could avoid any longer. The next part is where everything finally explodes, where truths are exposed, and where I face the consequences of my choice head on. If you're still with me, thank you. Like this if you understand why I drew the line. Subscribe for the rest of this story, and share what you think should happen next, because part 4 is where nothing stays hidden anymore. I'll see you in the next part. The explosion came sooner than I expected, and when it did, it wasn't loud at first. It was quiet, sharp, and deeply cruel, in a way that only people who know exactly where to hurt you can manage. It started about 3 weeks before the deadline I had given them. I came home from work one afternoon and immediately felt something was wrong. The house was too quiet, and there was an unfamiliar tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. As I walked into the living room, I noticed papers spread across the table, bank statements, my bank statements. My heart began to race. Sarah was sitting there, scrolling on her phone, completely unbothered. When she saw me, she looked up slowly and said, almost casually, that my son had some concerns about the household finances, and that they had decided to review things to make sure everyone was being fair. I asked her what she meant, my voice already shaking. That's when my son walked in and told me they thought it would be better if I started contributing more toward household expenses, since they were using the space more. I stared at him in disbelief. This was my house. I paid the mortgage. I paid the bills. I asked him who gave them the right to go through my private financial documents. Sarah smirked and said that as a family, there shouldn't be secrets. That was the moment something snapped inside me. Not in a screaming, dramatic way, but in a cold, clear way. I realized this was no longer about misunderstandings or boundaries. This was about power. They were trying to intimidate me, to confuse me, to make me doubt myself, and eventually force me out without looking like the bad guys. I calmly gathered my papers, looked at my son, and asked him if this was truly what he wanted, if he really believed this was acceptable behavior. He didn't answer. He never did when it mattered most. That night, I made phone calls I never thought I would make. I spoke to a lawyer friend, not to start a war, but to understand my rights, and what I learned both relieved and devastated me. Legally, the house was entirely mine. Everything was in my name. I had every right to ask them to leave immediately if I wanted to. I could have changed the locks the next day, but I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity, accountability, and maybe, just maybe, to force my son to finally see the truth. The final confrontation happened on a Sunday evening. I asked them both to sit down with me. My hands were steady, even though my heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest. I told them I knew what they had been doing, that I knew about the manipulation, the lies told to relatives, the attempts to control me financially and emotionally. Sarah immediately denied everything, calling me paranoid and dramatic. My son looked torn, glancing between us like a child caught between parents. Then I did something that shocked even myself. I took out my notebook, the one where I had written everything down. Dates, exact words, situations. I read them out loud, calmly, one by one. Every insult, every rule she imposed. Every time she spoke for my son, every time he stayed silent, the room went dead quiet. Sarah's face drained of color. She tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. For the first time in months, I didn't back down. When I finished, I looked directly at my son and asked him one simple question. I asked him if this was the marriage he wanted, one built on fear, control, and the destruction of his relationship with his mother. He broke down. He started crying in a way I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. He admitted he felt trapped, that he was constantly afraid of upsetting Sarah, that nothing he did was ever enough. Hearing that shattered me, but it also confirmed everything I had suspected. Sarah exploded. She accused me of turning him against her, of sabotaging their marriage. She screamed that I was jealous, that I couldn't stand not being the center of his life. And then, in her rage, she revealed the truth without realizing it. She said she needed to control everything because if she didn't, things fell apart. She admitted she didn't trust my son to make decisions on his own. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. That was the end. My son stood up and told her he needed space, that he couldn't live like this anymore. She laughed bitterly and said he would regret choosing me over her. I corrected her quietly. I told her this wasn't about choosing me. It was about choosing himself. She packed a bag that night and left, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. The aftermath was messy, painful, and quiet in a way that hurt almost as much as the chaos. My son didn't magically become okay. He was heartbroken, confused, ashamed. He apologized to me over and over, and while I forgave him, the wound didn't disappear overnight. Trust doesn't work that way. We started rebuilding slowly, cautiously. Some days were good. Others were filled with awkward silence and grief over what we had lost. Sarah tried to come back weeks later, promising change, crying, apologizing. My son listened, but this time he didn't fold. He told her he needed therapy, time, and independence. Watching him finally speak for himself was both painful and incredibly healing. Eventually, they separated, not with dramatic revenge or celebration, but with exhaustion and acceptance. Now, as I sit in my living room, I think about everything that happened. I lost the illusion that love alone is enough. I learned that boundaries are not cruelty, and standing up for yourself is not betrayal. Most importantly, I learned that being a mother doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity to keep your child close. This wasn't the ending I ever imagined, but it was the one that saved me, and it saved my son too, even if he doesn't fully realize it yet. In the final part, I'll tell you where we are now, what this experience truly taught me, and what I would tell any woman who finds herself in a similar situation. Like this video if you think I did the right thing. Subscribe for part 5, and leave your honest thoughts below, because I know this story will divide opinions. I'll see you in the final part. Now, looking back on everything from where I stand today, the silence in my house feels different. It's no longer heavy or threatening. It's calm, reflective, almost sacred. After Sarah left, there was no sudden happiness, no dramatic sense of victory. What followed was something much harder and much more real, healing. My son stayed with me for a while, sleeping in his old room like a stranger revisiting a past life. Some nights we talked until dawn, and other nights we barely spoke at all. He was grieving the marriage he thought he had, and I was grieving the years of closeness we lost to fear and control. Healing, I learned, doesn't happen in straight lines. He started therapy a few weeks later, something I gently suggested but never pushed. Watching him confront the patterns he had fallen into was both heartbreaking and hopeful. He admitted how easily he confused love with obligation, how afraid he was of being abandoned, and how that fear made him ignore the people who had always been there for him. Hearing him say those things didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. It showed me that this story wasn't just about a controlling daughter-in-law or a silent son. It was about two people learning, too late, how important it is to protect their own boundaries. Our relationship didn't snap back into place like a broken branch taped together. We rebuilt it piece by piece. He began asking for my opinion again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He apologized not just once, but many times in small, sincere ways. I apologized too for the moments when my fear of losing him made me stay quiet when I should have spoken sooner. We learned how to talk honestly, even when it was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable. As for Sarah, she eventually stopped contacting us. I don't hate her, even after everything. I see her now as someone deeply insecure, someone who mistook control for safety. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it helps me let go of the anger. Carrying that anger was never going to give me peace. Letting it go did. This experience changed me as a woman. I used to believe that being a good mother meant endless sacrifice, that my needs should always come last. Now I understand that self-respect is not selfish, and love that demands your silence is not love at all. I learned that sometimes the most painful choices are the most necessary ones, and that standing up for yourself doesn't mean you stop loving others. If you're a woman listening to this who feels pushed aside in your own life, whether by family, a partner, or even your own children, I want you to hear this clearly. You matter. Your voice matters. Your home, your peace, your dignity matter. You are not wrong for setting boundaries, and you are not cruel for refusing to disappear. So now I want to ask you one final time. Was I wrong for what I did? Or would you have done the same thing in my place? Like this video if you were on my side. Subscribe for more real, raw stories like this one. And share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. I read every single one. Thank you for listening to my story, for sitting with me through the pain and the growth. I'll see you all in the next story.